Today, we're going to create this animated table of contents sidebar that you may have seen on blog articles. It has a progress bar for page scrolling and highlights each section as it appears on screen. To follow along, you can grab the starter code in the description. With that, let's jump in. All right, so to start, I have a basic example blog post that contains a few different sections with headers and some paragraphs. Let's start by updating the page layout to accommodate the table of contents sidebar here on the left. So I'm going to go into this main tag that's surrounding the page, and let's update the styling here. I'm going to apply a CSS grid, define some grid columns. I'll do 10%, 1 unit, and 10%. And on large screens, I will make this a little bit different. So 15% on each side instead of 10%. Let me put these dashes. So this is messing it up because this article is the first child of the main, so it's squishing it into this first column. So for now, let's just add a dummy div just to take that space. Now this looks better. And I'm just going to remove this width of 80 view width as well because we don't need it anymore. Okay, now with the layout set up, let's actually create this sidebar for the table of contents. So I'm going to go here and create a new file under a components folder, and we'll call it table of contents.tsx. Make a new functional component. And let's go ahead and just pull this into the page as well. So table of contents. Now let's set up the structure of this component. So I'm going to replace this div. And here we're going to have a surrounding div. And I'll set this to height full and padding horizontal of 4. Then inside this, we'll do another div. And this one will be position sticky, top 20, height of 80 view height, padding Y of 32, flex, and a gap of 4. So what this will help ensure is that the sidebar takes up the full height, the surrounding container, and as I scroll, this sidebar will remain sticky. So then now inside this div, there's two primary children that we care about. The first will be the line that shows a scroll progress on the page, and the second will be the list of sections right next to it. So first for the line for scroll progress, this will be a div. This div will have height full, width of 0.5, so very thin, BG neutral of 300, rounded of full, and overflow hidden. So you see this line, this is the base progress bar. Now we need to fill this in with the scroll progress, which we'll get to in a little bit. The second child will be for the list of the section names. So I'll do another div. This one will have class names of hidden initially, on large screens flex. So when the screen is really small, we'll just hide the titles themselves to save space. But on larger screens, we will display them. Flex call gap 6, text small, and on XL screens, it'll be text base. Then inside of this, for now, we'll just put some dummy spans, and I'll give it some basic styles. So cursor of pointer, transition colors, and duration of 200. We're going to do some color switching, and I'll just say section. Okay, so now if we scroll, this sidebar is staying sticky as expected. Now let's set up the scroll tracking to fill up this progress bar. So here at the top, let's set up scroll tracking. So we'll use the use scroll hook from Framer Motion for this and extract the scroll Y progress property from that. So use scroll, and we're getting an error here because we need this to be a client component. Then we need to take this scroll progress, which is from 0 to 1, and convert it into a 0% to 100% value. So we'll use transform for this and store it in a variable called progress height. Use transform also from Framer Motion. Apply the transform on scroll Y progress, which will be a value from 0 to 1. And we want to map it to 0% to 100%. Now in this div for the scroll tracking, I'm going to do another div which will fill up the base line here. And this will need to be a motion div. So we'll make this a motion div. And we'll import motion from motion. On this div, we'll give styles of BG neutral 800 with the full origin of top. And I'll give dynamic styles of height, progress height. So now when I hit save, we can't see anything, but now if I scroll, you'll see this darker line starts to fill up the baseline. Now with the front end structure pretty much done, let's turn to the data flow of the section data into this table of contents component. So for this, we're going to set up a global React context that we'll use to store a global state of all this information. So I'll go and create a new file for this. I'll put it under a utils folder and we'll call it toc context.ts. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to define a type for the section data. And we'll export it. We'll call this type section, and we'll say it has two properties, an ID, which will be a number, and title will be a string. Now let's define the type for the data that the context will store. So we'll call this toc context type. We'll hold sections, and this will be an array of sections. We'll have a function called a register section, which will be how we populate the section array. This will be a function that takes a section and doesn't return anything. We'll store an active section, so which section is currently on screen. That will be a number that ties to the ID. And we'll have a setter for this active section property. This will be a function that takes a number and doesn't return anything. Okay, let's create an actual context, which we can use. So we'll export it and call it toc context, create context, React. And this will take the toc context type we just defined. And by default, we'll just set pretty basic default. So an empty array, the sections will do nothing. Active section will be 0, and set active section will also be an empty function. And finally, let's create a hook that we can use to access the values in this context. So we'll export it and we'll call it use toc context values. I'll create variables for active section first. So we'll use state, initially set to -1. We'll also create a state variable for the section array. Use state be an array of sections, and originally would be an empty array. And let's import use state. Let's define the functions here that we need in the context type. So we'll have register section. So take a section and we'll say set sections, and we'll take the previous value and we'll concat the new section in a new array. Okay, and now let's return all these data types. So return values, and we'll have sections, which is sections, register section, active section, and set active section. Okay, now let's actually integrate this context into the page. So let's go back into the main page, and here at the top, first above this return statement, I'm going to bring the values in from the context. So use toc context values. This is going to throw an error here because we need this to be a client component to use the context. So use client. Then surrounding this main tag, let's wrap everything in a toc context.provider with the value being these values we got from the hook. Let's put the ending tag down here as well. And now let's pull this data into our table content sidebar. So here at the top of the component, I will extract out sections and the active section. And we'll use context, and we'll pull in the toc context. Now let's go here and replace this dummy span with the actual section data. So here I'm going to say sections.map, and I'll destructure the ID and title. And for now, let's remove this span into the mapping. I'll replace this dummy text with the title. I'm also going to add an ID here in the form of a key, and this will just take the ID. Now, I'm going to also add some custom styles if a section is active. So for this class name, let's change this into a string literal. But then I need to add some conditional classes. So I'll say if the active section is equal to the ID of this span, then I'll use a text neutral of 800, so darker color. Otherwise, I'll use a lighter text neutral 300. So we got all the data flows connected up, but we can't see any section titles here on the left, and that's because we haven't registered these sections in the body with our context. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to make our own custom section component that extends the normal HTML section tag. So I'll make a new file in the components folder and we'll call it tracked section.tsx, a React functional component. Let's define the props we'll need in this section. So the custom properties we'll need is the section ID, the title that we want to use for this section. I also want to know if this section is the first or last section in the list. By default, these will be set to false, is first and is last. And we'll absorb other default properties. And the type here will be is first, which is optional, Boolean, is last, which is an optional Boolean. If I can spell Boolean. The section ID will be a number. The TLC title will be a string. And I want to join this with the default HTML props from an HTML default element. And here in this return statement, let's just return a regular section tag and we'll make it self-closing. And I'll just pass in the default properties, which will include the children here. So now we should be able to swap these in for our regular section tags on the page. Okay, so I've gone ahead and swapped all these out for the track section components. So we have section IDs, titles, and where relevant is first and is last is also set. Note I have excluded the first section tag and just made it a normal section tag. And this is just because here it's like an intro section, so I don't need it to show up in the sidebar. So now in this track section component, let's register these sections into our context. So first at the top of the component, let's access the context and I'll extract register section and set active section. So these two functions from the TOC context. Then I'll set up a use effect to run when this component mounts. So it'll be a use effect with an empty dependency array. And here I'm just going to call register section and I'll pass in the ID, which is section ID, and title, which is TOC title. So now we can see that these section titles are showing up here in the sidebar. Now you'll notice that we have duplicates of the sections here. And this is because of React strict mode, which is running when we're in dev. And this causes each component to render twice. Because it renders twice, this register section gets called twice for each section, and that's why it's showing up twice here in the sidebar. We will deal with that shortly. But before that, let's set up broadcasting for when the section becomes active and then passing that up into the sidebar to highlight it. So first I'll need to create a ref for this section. So we'll call it container and use ref, initially null, and I'll attach this ref to the section tag down here. Then we'll use scroll again from framer motion and pull out scroll Y progress. But this time we will use it to track specifically the scroll of this component itself. So we'll pass in properties here. So the target will be the container. And for offset, well, we want this to be 0% when the start of the component is at the center of the screen and the end of the component is at the center of the screen. So this defines when we consider a section to be active. Now let's set up a change listener on scroll Y progress so that then we can set the active section if it's on screen. So we'll say scroll Y progress on change event, take the value, and we'll say if the value is between 0 and 1, then we'll set the active section in the context to this section's ID. I'm also going to check if this is the first or last section and we have scrolled either before the first section or after the last section. So we'll say if the value is less than or equal to 0, and this is the first section, so we have scrolled above the first section, or the value is greater than or equal to 1, and it's the last section, so we've scrolled past the last section, then I want to set the active section to -1. So this will indicate if we're kind of out of bounds outside of these sections and we're just in a different part of the page. Okay, so now let's hit save. And I've refreshed the page. And again, we'll still see 2 copies of everything. We'll fix that shortly. But you can see now this section is highlighted for unmatched capabilities and versatility. If I scroll, it switches to the next section is highlighted, then the next one, then the next one. Now let's deal with these duplicate sections. And we also need to confirm that these are actually ordered correctly because we haven't enforced that yet. So let's go back into the context And before we just pass these sections on, let's process them. So we'll create a function called process sections. It will take an array of sections. And we need to do two things. The first is we need to filter for duplicates. And the second is we're going to sort them by the value in the ID. And we're going to assume the ID is in numerical order of how it's shown on page. So first, for this, I'm going to create the list of IDs. So this will be sections.map. I'll take the ID. I'll just simply extract out the ID to get an array of the IDs. And then I'll create a unique sections version. And this will be sections.filter. So for deduping, we'll take, again, extract the ID and the index as well. And we'll say filter it based on if the IDs array includes this ID at some point after the index. And then we're also going to sort. So let's say we will chain the sort here. So we'll sort. And based on two sections, we'll say sort it based on the ID order. And we'll return unique sections. And now let's actually use this process sections function when we pass it in. So instead of just passing sections, we'll pass process sections of sections. So now when I hit save, we can see on the right, we've only got one copy of each section, and we confirmed that it's sorted in the correct order. Okay, so there are two more things I want to do here. The first is I want to be able to click on any of these sections and have it scroll to the relevant section in the body. So first, let's go back to the track section component. And on this section tag, I'm going to add an ID. And this ID will be a string literal, and it will be section dash whatever the section ID is. So we'll be able to identify in the article body where each section is. Then in the table of contents component, for each span, we're going to add an on-click listener. And on-click, we'll say document.getElement by ID. And this will be the section dash ID. And we'll say scroll into view, and we'll pass behavior of smooth. So let's try this. I'm going to click one of these, and it scrolls to that section here, the cutting edge technology under the hood. Now, notice that I clicked cutting edge technology. It did scroll to that section and put it to the very top. But because of how we define whether a section is active based on the center line of the screen, the active section is actually set to this next section here on applications impact, and it's highlighting that one. So this can be a bit weird and confusing. So to fix this, let's just add a scroll margin on these sections. So here, back in the track sections component, I'm just going to add a style tag, and I'll just say scroll margin, and let's just set it to 40 view height. So now let's try this one more time. If I click on a section, it will now scroll, but now it won't scroll the section all the way to the top of the screen. It will scroll it, in this case, 40 view height from the top. And so now this nicely lines up with our definition of what an active section is. Final thing I want to do is I want to hide the sidebar altogether once we're outside these four sections on the screen. So back in the table of contents component, let's go to this div, which is sticky. I'm going to convert this into a motion div, and I'll update the end tag as well. Then above the return statement in this component, I'm going to create a state variable for whether we should show this table of contents or not. So show TOC, set show TOC, and use state default value will be if the active section from context is greater than or equal to 0. Let me import use state. Then we need to update this as we scroll down the page. So here I'll use a onChange listener on this scroll y progress of the whole page. So scroll y progress dot on change event, take the value, and I'll say set whether we should show TOC, and I'll set it to if the active section is greater than or equal to 0. So now let's use this to hide the table of contents. So here on this div, I'm going to give it an initial and animate property from frame of motion. So initial, we'll say opacity is 0 and display is none. And then on animate, opacity, if show TOC is true, then we'll set opacity to 1, otherwise it'll be 0. And for display, if show TOC is true, then we'll say display flex, otherwise display none. hit save and refresh the page, and we can see this is now hidden. If I start scrolling, you can see we get this showing up. We keep scrolling through these pages, and then at the bottom, it's not hiding right now. And that's because of how this is sized, right? These content sections are not big enough such that this, let's say, ethical AI section will ever truly come off screen, and this last section becomes active by getting to the middle of the screen. So to fix this, I'm just going to have a global offset on whether this sidebar should show at all. And I'll just define it based on the page height. Let's say for the first 5% of scroll and the last 5% of scroll, I definitely don't want to show the scroll bar. And then any way in between, we'll apply the default logic. So I'm just going to store this offset in a variable at the top so we can play around with it later if we wanted to. We'll call it hidden offset. I'll just set it to 5%. And then here, when we are setting the show TOC variable, I'll say, well, we'll check if the active section is greater than or equal to 0. But I'll also check if the value of scroll by progress is greater than or equal to hidden offset, and that it's less than or equal to 1 minus hidden offset. So in this case, if it's 95% on the page. Okay, so now if I hit save and refresh the page, now for the first 5%, it's not showing no matter what. Then when we hit 5%, it nicely shows up, and we've already made some progress down the page. As we keep scrolling, and now when we get to the last 5%, it will automatically hide itself, even though the content doesn't go that far. So that's what we have for this video. Feel free to drop any questions in the comments. If you got any value out of this, please like and subscribe for more content like this. And on screen now is another video for you to check out, and I'll see you in the next one.